Great. Well, good morning and welcome to the 2022 Housing Trust Fund Operating Subsidy Program Request for Proposals information session. In the webinar, we'll address the application process for the 2022 Housing Trust Fund RFP. We'll record the session and it'll be posted on our website in a few days after the session, along with this PowerPoint and the question and answers from today. So I'm Vicki Farden, and I'm the Supportive Housing Policy Specialist and Operating Subsidy Program Manager at Minnesota Housing. So most of our time today will be the presentation, but we'll have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. And assisting today with technology and the Q&A and notes are Meredith Mayrand and Sarah Roig. So thanks for your interest and participation. And we'll jump right into it, into kind of some technology tips. So in the GoTo Toolbar, there's several options for the question and answer time after the presentation. So there's two ways to ask questions. The toolbar on the right-hand side of the screen allows you to ask questions using the questions feature, which we've outlined on the screen in the orange box. At any time during the webinar, you can type your question and click the send button. The question will land in a queue for us and we'll answer your questions during the Q&A part of the session. So feel free to type your questions in anytime through the presentation. Then in the red rectangle is a hand raising feature right at the bottom of that grouping. When you click on the hand icon, it's just like raising your hand in an in-person audience. Then we can call on you verbally and then we'll unmute your phone or your speaker so that you can ask your question. And then you can listen to the webinar through your computer, but if you don't have a speaker microphone on your computer, you can switch to the telephone option at any time during the presentation if you want to ask a question. So, next slide. Okay, so this is our mission. We're the State Housing Finance Agency, and we believe that housing is the foundation for success. So we collaborate with individuals, communities, and partners to create, preserve, and finance affordable housing and support housing, of course. Next slide. So today, we will review the operating subsidy program and expectations, and then we'll review the request for proposal, the application scoring and materials, and then go over the timeline. And once we're through with that, we'll go to your questions. Next slide. And then next slide. So the purpose of the operating subsidy grant is pretty straightforward. Is to provide operating support to maintain the economic viability of supportive housing developments serving people experiencing homelessness. It can be used to pay for revenue shortfall, front desk and security, or tenant service coordination. Next slide. The operating subsidy program grant advances the agency's strategic plan and aligns with our supportive housing goals and objectives for creating and sustaining supportive housing, addressing systemic barriers that create housing inequities, and supporting solutions that increase housing stability and access. And equity is a key focus for the area for the agency and also for supportive housing. All supportive housing should be designed to address equitable housing access for populations that have been historically underserved and overrepresented in the homeless population. Next slide. So I'll go over the program expectations that are outlined in the RFP instructions. I'll just go through them quickly and highlight a few of them that are new. So the population served are people experiencing homelessness, with some units designated for long-term homeless households or high priority homeless households. The income restrictions are 60% AMI at initial occupancy, with a priority for 30% AMI. And we expect that service provision at your supportive housing developments follows supportive housing industry best practices, such as person-centered, trauma-informed planning, housing first, 2-gen for families, etc. And then something new for this housing funding, any funding we provide to housing providers after March 2021, you're required to follow our tenant screening criteria in Minnesota Housing's tenant selection guidelines. So make sure you review the guidelines and adjust your tenant selection plans as necessary. And of course, we expect that you will maintain full occupancy at the property to the best of your ability. Next slide. So we also expect that you will pursue and use all available resources to cover the costs of operating the property and providing services to tenants. If you aren't enrolled in the Medicaid Housing Stabilization Service as a provider, please get enrolled and get tenants enrolled so you can pay for those services with that resource. And we encourage you to attend our supportive housing engagement sessions that we host a couple times a year. And now we're also starting to have office hours every few months. And we also have a supportive housing email that you can contact us with questions. So we also expect that you will set and measure outcome goals for tenants and the property, and that you'll report in HMIS and complete the annual supportive housing survey. And of course, we expect you to comply with program requirements and cooperate with state monitoring of the housing and the operating subsidy program. And then we expect that you submit your draw requests within 60 days of the end of your fiscal year. We'll cover draw requests in more depth when we do the due diligence training in May for the grant contract agreement, but we want you to be aware of some of the changes that will be in this new contract. So we have a new draw request and report form that will be included in your grant contract. So you need to use that one. Do not use an old one. Use the new one. You'll also be submitting the draw request through the multifamily secure upload tool. You will not be emailing them to Meredith anymore. So you'll be submitting them to that secure upload, and we'll provide those instructions when we send our reminders for draw requests. The draw request also now includes report information that you will need to track, and I'll cover those in the next slide. Go ahead, Meredith, next slide. So on the report, we will ask you to report on your occupancy for the year. And with our focus on equity, we want you to track and pay attention to the tenant demographics of households that are denied or not accepted into your housing, and also on participants that are evicted or where you do a non-renewal of their lease. So we'll talk more about this at our due diligence training in May. Next slide. And so I just want to highlight just more about equity as an expectation and key focus area to end homelessness and address disparities for Minnesota housing and for the operating subsidy program. So in addition to the reporting that I just reviewed, we've added an equity section in the application. So make sure to address that. Take a look at that, because we want to make sure that the populations that we're trying to reach have housing access, they can get into your housing, that you have culturally appropriate practices to serve the population, and that can be any, all the variety of different types of populations, and then that you're tracking and reviewing that information to make sure that you are providing equitable housing. So basically, applicants will need to demonstrate in your responses in the equity section that you have culturally appropriate practices to provide effective service delivery for the population served in the supportive housing property. And culture can be defined as race, ethnicity, geography, history, values, and shared spaces that are influenced by characteristics that develop meaning among people and allows people to be who they are and empowers people to take pride in their lived experience. So examples of shared cultures might include racial or ethnic groups, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, and/or ally, deaf and hard of hearing, or military personnel and veterans, just to mention a few. So you'll need to have a plan to monitor that, and we'll be looking at your report information each year too, in addition to what you put in your application this year. Next slide. So for this year for the RFP, we have up to 3.21 million for the 2-year grant period. Unfortunately, we don't have any additional funding, so your request cannot exceed the current grant amount that you have for your annual amount, and it must be in the same category of use. So if you currently get funding for revenue shortfall, you can't request funding for front desk, etc. So you have to stay in the same categories that you have. Eligible applicants are the current grantees only. We expect to have applications from 29 properties, and the applicant must be the ownership entity. So in many cases, the ownership entity is an LLP or an LP, an LLC or an LP. And sometimes we also have a number of government grantees, and then some are nonprofit organizations. But the applicant must be the ownership entity. So we'll keep stressing that in our different pieces of the application. So the grant start date is July 1st, 2022, or October 1st, 2022, or January 1st, 2023, depending on the fiscal year of the property and your current grant. That will end this year. So next slide. So basically the application components are the RFP and instructions. So make sure you read that well for all the information related to the application. Submissions need to be uploaded using the multifamily secure upload tool. And the application materials include the application, which is basically the narrative of the application, the budget Excel workbook, then the organizational chart of the ownership entity, the affirmative action form and certificate, and the current financial information for the ownership entity. And in that case, the ownership entity, that's why we need your organizational chart. Because if you're an LLC or LP, we need to know who the sponsor organization is, because we'll need their financial information for the sponsor entity. So next slide. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of submitting the right documents with the right information and by the deadline. So on the day we receive the applications, our staff review the materials submitted to make sure the applications meet the threshold criteria. So that happens before we read them and before we give them to reviewers to score. So make sure you highlight these bullets because if you don't submit something, your application could be rejected before it's reviewed. And also, late applications will not be considered. Incomplete applications may be considered if the omission is deemed immaterial at our discretion, and we may request additional information or for clarification. Next slide. And for the affirmative action requirement, if you're applying for more than $100,000 in this RFP, this applies to you. So you'll need to determine if you're subject to the Minnesota Human Rights Act. So completing the affirmative action form is important. So you must submit the form even if you are exempt according to the instructions on the form. So we need to see that checklist that you do on that form. And then in addition, if you need to provide documentation of compliance, if the box you check on the form indicates that you need to do that, you need to submit that. So we will be looking for that information as indicated on the form. So it's important that you submit the form. Next slide. And then, as I mentioned, we need the financial information for the ownership entity and based on your overall budget and the amount you are applying for. So again, for LLCs or LPs, it must be the financial information for the sponsor entity. And that's why, again, it's important to submit your organizational chart to show who the sponsor entity is. So it's based on the type of documentation you submit is based on how much gross revenue the owner has in a given year. So you either submit board reviews, financial statements, IRS Form 990, or the certified financial audit based on your gross revenues in a given year. Government agencies are not required to submit financials, and that includes counties, HRAs, PHAs, and tribes. Next slide. So now we'll go over application scoring. I'll walk through the scoring of each section and highlight a few applicable questions to provide a little more context. So applications will be scored based on program design, equity, demonstrated need, and grantee performance for a total of 100 possible points. Next slide. Program design is scored based on the application responses in section 1 of the narrative, program design. So we'll be looking to see that the applicant follows industry best practices for supportive housing, that you have effective strategies for tenant engagement, that you offer all the service sets outlined in the supportive housing information and resources, Appendix D, and there's a link to that document on the slide and also in the application materials. and that you have policies and practices to address lease infractions with the goal of housing stability, and that you set and measure outcome goals for tenants and demonstrate positive results. Next slide. And as I've mentioned, equity is a key strategy to address systemic inequities in Minnesota that perpetuate homelessness. So equity is scored based on your responses in the application narrative to Section 2, equity. So we'll ask you to talk about, and we'll score you on how you're serving populations overrepresented in the homeless population and impacted by systemic housing barriers. That might vary based on your location, but I think most of you are serving those populations based on our data, but we want you to talk about that and make sure that you're aware of that and you tell us who you're serving, because then we want you to demonstrate that you have culturally appropriate housing and services for the population served, and that supportive housing staff are reflective of the characteristics of the population served or have employed efforts to address the unique needs of the population, and that you follow Housing First principles and have inclusive screening criteria to serve the intended populations. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll ask you to report demographic data to track the equity outcomes. Next slide. So demonstrated need has the most points based on the specific purpose of the operating subsidy program to sustain supportive housing. So this is scored based on your responses to Section 4 through 6 of the application, the budget form, and review of the last submitted draw request and financial statement that you submitted. We have that here, so you don't need to resubmit that. We'll use that in our review. And we'll look to see that you demonstrate a need for the operating subsidy funds for the different purposes, that you demonstrate that all other funding and revenue sources for the proposed activities have been pursued and exhausted, and that you demonstrate reasonable costs for the activities funded and cost containment efforts. So this is your opportunity to give context to your request for your funding. So next slide. And then we'll score on your performance. So it's scored internally by our staff, and it's based on Section 3 of the application in our administrative records for grant administration for the current operating subsidy grant period for the following performance items. So occupancy performance, we looked at the applicant has maintained good occupancy levels and rent collections, that you've had timely grant closing and timely submittals of draw requests, budgets, and financial reports, that you've complied with any special conditions of your current grant as outlined in your grant contract agreement and amendments, and that you have timely response and responsive communication with Minnesota Housing. So when we ask you a question or ask you for more information, that you respond to us in a reasonable time, and that you have timely HMIS data entry that meets data quality standards and our supportive housing report submissions, and that you're utilizing the long-term homeless or high-priority homeless units based on the annual HMIS data. Next slide. So now for application materials. The application narrative has 6 sections. As I mentioned, Section 1 through 3 is to be completed by all applicants to discuss program design, equity, and occupancy. Section 4, if you request revenue shortfall. You need to complete this section to discuss your demonstrated need. Section 5 is for front desk, and Section 6 is for tenant service coordination. And again, you can only request those if that's what you currently receive your operating subsidy grant for. And then the signature page, it can be signed electronically, digitally, or with a wet signature and submitted as a PDF as a separate form. So please do not change your forms, submit them in their the state that we sent them to you. Don't convert them to a different format. So next slide. So the application budget. This is an Excel budget that you must submit in this form. Do not convert this or alter it or save it as a PDF. We use the information in this document to extract the data for the application tracking, our scoring and selections, to generate your contracts and your selection letters. So please do not alter this. It is a locked form. So, but some people have tried doing funny things because they want to do put something else in there. We're going to open the budget form to do a quick review of each of the tabs. So Meredith, can you open that? Great. So this is the instructions tab. Please read the instructions for an overview of what we require for each section of the budget. And so then the application information. So I just want to call out a few things on here. This is where you put the property name, which is in a pull-down list. You can't type something in here. It's a drop-down list. So find your property on that list. This information will pull into all the other tabs. So complete that first, and then just information on the property address. The D number will auto-populate based on what you pick in your property name. And then the applicant owner name should be the ownership entity again. And then household type, total number of supportive housing units, and then how many LTH, HPH units you have. And then at the bottom, we've got vacancy, and your occupancy history for the last year, to give us kind of your occupancy and turnover for the last year. And so then please go to the next tab, Meredith, this contact tab. Make sure you fill in each of these boxes, even if they're redundant. Again, the applicant name should be the legal name on the grant contract agreement for selected applicants. And the authorized representative should be the person authorized to execute grant contract agreement per delegate authority, resolution, or bylaws. So it'll be the person that we name in the grant contract as the primary point of contact, and not the person, not your grant administrator or your financial person, unless they have the delegated authority. So make sure you complete these, put the right information in each box, because we use this to keep in touch with you and to be able to contact the right person for any questions we might have. So then the next tab is the revenue shortfall budget. So this should not be a mystery to you. This will auto-populate the top fields from the information you enter in the earlier tab. And then the budget is the same budget that you currently use for your draws. So we also added the reserve balance. You just need to enter that for year 1, not year 2, and your annual deposit to reserve. So you don't need to put it in year 2, just year 1. But otherwise, all the other fields you enter for year 1 and year 2. And basically, you're just estimating the revenues and expenses for year 1 of the grant based on your last completed fiscal year, and estimate for year 2 based on your current budget practice. However, you're estimated, increased costs for utilities and things like that. And then use the notes section to the right to explain any unique items or significant changes since the last draw request, or differences between the budget for year 1 and year 2. So next tab, Meredith, to the front desk budget. Again, you're estimating your revenues and budget based on the last completed fiscal year. Please include all revenues for front desk and security costs. Some people just put the operating subsidy revenues and expenses, and no, we need to know the full cost of what it costs to operate your front desk and any unique security items. So make sure you enter all of those, and you don't include the operating subsidy grant in your revenues. You just include your other revenues. So the source field under revenues is a drop-down box. So pick the right source, the type of source, state, housing support, philanthropic, whatever type of source it is. And then in the description, be specific, name the exact source. Don't say DHS, say which grant with DHS. Is it the Homeless Youth Act grant? Is it the Long-Term Homeless Supportive Service grant? So we want, be as specific as you can. And then for expenses, again, include all expenses for front desk and security. Under type, again, there's several choices, whether it's staffing, equipment, supplies. Choose the right one for each line, and then describe it more fully in the description. And if it's staffing, please put your FTE percents on that line. If it's 4 FTEs or 0.5, please put that in that note. And then again, be as specific as you can, and use the notes section to explain anything, any differences from year 1 to year 2, or things you're expecting to change, anything you need us to know in your budget. And then the last one is the application, or is the tenant service coordination tab. Basically the exact same thing as the operating subsidy for front desk. It has the same pull down menus for source, and then description, same. Please be descriptive as possible, and include all your revenues for services, all the revenues you use to provide supportive services at your supportive housing, unless it's a third party, providing those services. But for you, whatever the main service provider at the supportive housing site, we want you to include all the service revenues on this tab. And then also the same for expenses. We want to know all your staffing and expenses for services at the property. Again, same drop-down list for type. Please describe staffing, describe anything in more detail, whether it's equipment or supplies. And for staffing, we want to know the FTE. And then again, use the notes section to explain anything unique or different or changing. So that is the budget workbook, which I think should look familiar to most of you. It's pretty similar to what we've done before with a few tweaks. So now we'll go to the submission materials and timeline. So again, just to reiterate what we reviewed before, these are the application materials that must be submitted by the due date using the multifamily secure upload tool. Using that online tool, you send items to mhfa.app@state.min.us. And this is described in the RFP instructions. And also there's a link so that you can review the upload tool instructions if you need more information about how to upload your materials. So do not email your application materials to any of us. You must upload them in the secure upload tool. So, and that is noted several times in your materials. So again, the things that you'll be submitting are the application, which is the narrative, the application signature page, which can be a PDF depending on how you sign it, the budget Excel workbook that we just went over, the organizational chart of the ownership entity, the affirmative action form and certificate, and the current financial information for the ownership entity. So, next slide. So this is the timeline from here. This is also listed in the RFP instructions. So the frequently asked questions from this session, along with other questions, will be posted on our website on or around February 7th, 2022 and February 16th, 2022. With the deadline for submission of final questions to Minnesota Housing on Monday, February 14th, 2022 at 4:30 p.m. So we have some new grant management policies that are different from the last time you applied. So you just won't be able to pick up the phone and call me and ask me a question the day before your application is due. I won't be able to answer them. So please, try and look through everything and work on your application materials so that you can submit your questions before February 14th. All the application materials must be submitted by noon on Wednesday, February 23rd. No exceptions for late applications. And then we'll make our recommendations to our board on Thursday, April 28th, and you'll receive notification of our decision by the next day. If awarded funds, you'll then enter into the due diligence phase, and agencies will be required to submit certain materials to us in order to complete your grant contract agreement. That must be done by Friday, June 3rd, in order for us to complete your contracts by July 1st. So the contract start dates, as I mentioned earlier, depends on your current fiscal year for your property and your grant. It's either July 1, 2022, October 1, 2022, or January 1st, 2023. So that's it. So now we are open for questions. So any questions, Sarah?
I'm just looking at the question box and for hands raised. I do not see any right now, but we can give it just a minute to make sure.
Okay, great.
All right, I'm not seeing anything, so it looks like you covered everything, Vicki. Thank you.
All right, clear, totally clear. So everybody will do a fantastic application for the operating subsidy RFP. So if you have questions after this session, you can contact me. This is my email address. That's the best way to contact me because we are not in the office. So if you call my phone number, you'll get a voice message and I'll call you back when I can. But email is really the best at this time to contact me. Don't ask Meredith questions about this RFP. Don't ask Sarah Roik or Sarah Gamel or any of our asset management or compliance officers. I'm the only one who can officially answer your questions. So I can answer any basic questions about your application, but I can't give you any advice about how to answer questions, things like that. But if you need to know, what document do I submit for this? Or what do you mean by this? We can answer those questions and then we'll post them on our webpage under frequently asked questions. So thank you for joining us today and good luck with your applications.